Our final session to round off the conference, Growing Resilience, Agriculture and the Future of Food Security in Australia. Now, resilience is critical to overcome and embrace the challenges and opportunities facing Australian agriculture, ensuring food security amid climate change, navigating shifting markets, and keeping up evolving consumer demands are just some of the key issues, all things you've really got into over the past couple of days. And building resilient farming systems that support sustainable production, protect natural resources, and secure a stable food supply for future generations will be critical to our success. To discuss this and more, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Kurt Hockey. Now, Kurt is responsible for the Agricultural Forecasting and Trade branch in ABARES as Assistant Secretary. The branch covers global agriculture and food modelling, agricultural forecasts and market analysis, climate and agronomy, and analysis of emerging agricultural policy issues. Prior to joining ABARES, he's worked with a range of economic and policy roles at the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Treasury, the Department of Industry, Science, Resources, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'll pass you over to Kurt.
Thank you very much. And can I say thank you very much for sticking with us through to the end of the conference. As a speaker in the last session, it's always good to know you've got a crowd to talk to. And I'm really excited to talk to you about food security today. It's a good time to have the discussion as risks around national food security have become more complex and more uncertain. While it's a popular issue, certainly since the weekend it's taken off a bit, and it's also been great to see that food security has been a theme that's come up in a number of sessions that we've had today. Geopolitical tensions, supply chain disruptions, and climate change are reshaping how countries think about their food security, and it's exposing vulnerabilities that were once less visible to us. At the same time, as demonstrated through the recent cost of living increases, food security is not a given for all Australians. The government's food security strategy aims to provide a clear-eyed look at what's working well, where the risks are, and how best to respond. It'll look across the food system and be developed in consultation with farmers, fishers, industry, and the community more broadly. The strategy has the ability to support the social licence of Australian agriculture. It can remind the Australian public of the role Australian agriculture makes for our food security and ensure agriculture's relevance is appropriately considered as land competition intensifies and the trade-off around agricultural production is increasingly scrutinised. And these are the things that David Galliano was talking about yesterday. But to support the discussion by the panel today, I'll be talking to you about three things. First, what is food security? The foundations of Australia's food security, and then thinking about what are the questions we need to ask ourselves before resolving what is the role of government here. Food security is multifaceted. It's more than just about producing enough food. It's been defined as all people at all times having sufficient access to safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for a healthy life. A number of international organisations have assessed Australia as a highly food secure country. In international comparisons, we tend to rank well in terms of managing undernourishment, affordability, and food availability. But that's not the experience of everyone in Australia. An ABS survey found that in 2023, just over 13% of Australian households either had not enough food or not enough money for food, at least once in the previous 12 months. The report found that people who were most vulnerable tended to be low-income earners, people living in remote areas, culturally and linguistically diverse groups, single-parent households, older people, and people who are homeless. So with all that in mind, what's Australia's food security based on? Australia's food security rests on three pillars. The first is Australia starts from a position of relatively high household incomes by international standards, and that matters for food security. Combined with our tax and transfer system, our overall inequality tends to be around the OECD average. This helps keep food insecurity low from a national perspective, but as I just said, that doesn't work for everyone. In relation to Pillar 2, Australia benefits from having an incredibly responsive agricultural sector, which reflects a market-based system that's closely tied into global markets. Our farmers respond to prices, seasons, and consumer demand. When there's shortages in a market, prices increase and production given time will follow. When the costs of inputs increase, we ration our inputs and usually target them towards the higher value commodities. Integration with global markets has been central to this success. It enables scale, drives competition and productivity, and provides access to critical imports at the best available prices. The third pillar is about reliability investments, and these underpin production and trade. They include infrastructure, biosecurity, research and development, sustainable resource management, and access to a diverse range of markets. These investments are often unseen, but are critical. They underpin our ability to produce, move, and access food reliably and reduce exposures to disruptions. They help the system recover when conditions change. The three pillars have allowed Australian agriculture to deliver for the country, even when we've had droughts, natural disasters, or shocks around input availability. During production shocks such as drought, product has been redirected from export markets to domestic consumers, shielding Australian households from the full magnitude of that shock. And you can see in the slide behind me, while production can be volatile, domestic consumption is relatively smooth, with households maintaining access to food products. For example, despite major spikes in fertiliser and energy prices following Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, agricultural productions remained relatively stable. During COVID, when the movement of workers and commodities was heavily disrupted, the agriculture sector still performed quite strongly, although as many of you know in the room, we had to work really hard to achieve that. COVID also reminded Australians, though, not to take for granted agriculture and food production. But overall, our market-based system manages most day-to-day risks in food production pretty well. So given I've just spoken to you about these strengths, what's the problem? The problem is, in some situations, our strengths can actually become weaknesses. Our food system does have limits, and the vulnerability of the system will continue to change over time. Much of our past success has relied on access to overseas markets. Recent experience, including COVID, has sharpened the attention of the vulnerability we have on overseas supply chains, particularly where Australia relies on globally traded inputs such as fuel, fertiliser, chemical and seed. Disruptions in logistics or shipping or upstream production can be quickly transmitted through the supply chain, affecting production, prices, processing and distribution. And COVID's taught us some important lessons about the need to manage product and risk across the entire supply chain. But at the same time, there's longer-term pressures facing our food system, including climate change and, again, competing land use. And they're reshaping agricultural production and trade in ways that are still playing out. And as we're seeing at the moment, long-standing geopolitical tensions continue to strain our trading relationships, directly or indirectly. At the same time, we've also got rare but high-impact events that also remain part of the landscape. This could include a potential major geopolitical disruption that simultaneously affects energy, shipping, and critical agricultural inputs. These are very different risks, and they all require different policy responses. The sort of policy response that needs to be thought of, not just in the agriculture portfolio. These issues relate to affordability, nutrition, trade access, national security, and disaster preparedness. Some of these risks sit well beyond what markets can reasonably manage on a day-to-day basis. But before we say this is what government should do, there are a range of questions we need to ask ourselves. The first question is, what's our objective? It seems really simple, to improve food security, but it's a complex system and there's more than one way to achieve it. And depending on how you do that, it can have significant impacts on both Australian agriculture and Australian consumers. And we've seen that play out in some of the discussions and questions that we've had over the last couple of days. We've seen some people focusing on the importance of affordability, others on nutrition and food choices, and others on reliability of production. And some things you can do can help everyone in the system, but in some cases there are trade-offs. And having a clear sense of what we're trying to achieve through the strategy will help manage those trade-offs and explain it to stakeholders who've got an interest in this issue. The second question is, what sort of risks do we want to manage? Should we be focused on the short-term disruptions to consumers and farmers, such as a key region being cut off because of flood, or short-term shipping disruptions, or because of a disease outbreak? Others might be looking to prepare agriculture for those long-term challenges that I was talking about, whether they be structural change or increased climate volatility. You could also ration your efforts to be focused around preparing for those rare but extreme black swan events. And finally, you could look at some of the more enduring challenges that we've had, such as longer-term trends around household affordability, income, and incomes. The third question is to what extent do we want to minimise the risks as opposed to prepare for the adjustment? Measures to protect agriculture from supply chain risks could include greater domestic stockpiles or domestic input production. And for consumers, it might involve supermarkets having readjusting their inventory management and distribution networks. However, if we're looking to support adjustment after something has happened, it might be about improved information on domestic and international inventories. It could be about having more ready access to alternative sources of imports, or it could be about focusing on improving agricultural production so we actually use less inputs overall. And we could ask ourselves similar questions about preventative health and nutritional outcomes. The fourth question, which is a bit of a cliche for an economist, and my favourite, is who pays? While interventions can be designed to create more resilient and sustainable food systems, preparedness comes with a cost. Strengthening onshore supply chains, hardening infrastructure, better information, changing distribution networks aren't free. There's a cost, and there's a question about who in the system will pay it. And the final question is, do the benefits exceed the costs? Is the intervention actually worth it? We need to make sure that the costs are proportionate to the risks. We don't want to end up spending more money on a solution than the actual costs of the problem. Now, in reality, the questions I've asked aren't really either-or questions, but they do highlight the questions that policymakers are going to need to work through with stakeholders. We do need to be sure that the interventions we make don't build unnecessary costs into our production systems, which would result in a higher cost to consumers and weigh on our competitiveness in overseas markets. For more business as usual events, governments can help by improving information, creating better regulatory frameworks, which not only can support adjustment, but can create a better environment for the private sector to make the investments it needs. At the same time, black swan events are different. They're large, unpredictable, and they can be costly shocks, and they can't be managed by households or companies alone. In these instances, governments need to intervene directly and decisively, and the levers to address the issues will be found across government. In such circumstances, the question isn't whether or not government has a role, but how extensive and ongoing that intervention should be. But greater reliability does come at a cost, and with any insurance decision, the discipline is to ensure that the premium we are paying is proportionate to the risk being insured against. Looking at international experience, when food security comes under strain, pressure can build for rapid and strong intervention, even when those responses risk distorting incentives or weakening market-based foundations that support our food security over time. Such policies in the long run will weigh on our competitiveness and flexibility and result in higher prices for Australians. So as Australia develops the National Food Security Strategy, the task ahead is to mitigate the risks without getting in the way of what's worked. So I think it's a good time to think about the policy now and consider some of the questions I've raised today. And now that I've thrown all those questions out there, I look forward to hearing from our panellists on their views about developing the strategy. Thanks very much.